Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. In our previous lecture, we completed the anatomy of the forebrain and learned how the brain plans our thoughts, emotions, and voluntary movements. But have you ever wondered, who actually carries those commands from the brain to the muscles? The answer is the spinal cord. Today, we begin one of the most important topics in physiology, the motor functions of the spinal cord. Before we jump into physiology, let's quickly revise its embryology and anatomy. During early development, the brain and spinal cord are formed from a structure called the neural tube. The upper part of the neural tube develops into the brain, while the lower part becomes the spinal cord. Think of it like this. The brain is the CEO of the body, and the spinal cord is the main communication highway carrying information between the brain and the rest of the body. Now take a look at today's learning roadmap. In this series, we'll learn everything step by step. We'll start with the big picture, then understand the organization of the spinal cord, followed by motor neurons, interneurons, muscle spindles, the gamma motor system, the Golgi tendon organ, and finally the important spinal reflexes, including the stretch reflex, flexor reflex, crossed extensor reflex, and walking reflexes. We'll finish by discussing the clinical importance of all these concepts. Look at the diagram on the right. This single picture summarizes what we'll learn throughout this chapter. The brain sends descending motor commands to the spinal cord. At the same time, sensory receptors in the muscles, such as the muscle spindle, continuously send information back to the spinal cord. Inside the spinal cord, interneurons process this information and communicate with motor neurons, which finally activate the muscles to produce smooth, coordinated movement. So, the spinal cord is not just a cable connecting the brain to the body, it is an intelligent processing center that can generate reflexes, coordinate movement, maintain posture, and even produce walking patterns without waiting for instructions from the brain. Let's begin with the big picture and discover how the spinal cord controls movement, step by step. Now that we know the spinal cord is the communication highway between the brain and the body, an important question comes up. Why do we even need the spinal cord? Why can't the brain control every muscle directly? Let's understand this with a simple example. Imagine you want to pick up a glass. First, your brain decides to pick it up. Then the command travels down to the spinal cord. But the spinal cord doesn't just pass the message, it actually processes the information. It decides which muscles should contract, which muscles should relax, how much force is needed, and how to keep your balance while you move. Only then does it send the final command to your muscles, allowing you to lift the glass smoothly. Think of it like a company. The brain is the CEO. It makes the big decision. The spinal cord is the manager. It organizes the work. And the muscles are the workers that perform the action. The spinal cord also contains reflex circuits. These allow your body to react in milliseconds without waiting for the brain. For example, if you touch a hot object, your hand pulls away immediately. This fast response protects your body from injury. So remember this key point. The brain gives the goal, but the spinal cord figures out how to achieve it quickly, accurately, and efficiently. Now let's see how the spinal cord is organized to perform these amazing functions. Now let's look at the three main functions of the spinal cord. Everything the spinal cord does can be understood in three simple steps: input, processing, and output. First, receive sensory information. Imagine you accidentally touch a hot cup. Receptors in your skin detect the heat and generate a nerve impulse. This impulse travels through a sensory neuron and enters the spinal cord through the posterior or dorsal root. This is the input to the spinal cord. Second, process the information. Once inside the spinal cord, the signal reaches the gray matter where thousands of interneurons analyze it. These interneurons receive information not only from sensory neurons but also from the brain. They compare all the signals and decide the best response. They determine which muscles should contract, which should relax, and how strong the movement should be. This entire decision-making process takes only a few milliseconds. Third, send the motor output. After the decision is made, motor neurons carry the command out of the spinal cord through the anterior or ventral route to the muscles. The muscles contract and the movement occurs. So always remember this sequence. Sensory neuron brings information in, interneurons process and decide, and motor neurons send the final command to the muscles. This input to processing to output pathway is the basic principle behind every spinal reflex and every voluntary movement that we'll study in the coming lectures. Now let's answer a very important question. Why do we need gamma motor neurons? Imagine you're holding a cup of hot tea. When your brain wants to lift the cup, it activates alpha motor neurons. These neurons make the main muscle fibers called extrafusal fibers contract. But there's a problem. Inside every muscle is a muscle spindle which acts like a stretch sensor. If only the main muscle contracts, the spindle becomes loose or slack. A slack spindle cannot detect changes in muscle length, so it stops sending accurate information to the spinal cord. That means the brain loses important feedback and movements become less precise, so the body has a clever solution. At the same time that the brain activates alpha motor neurons, it also activates gamma motor neurons. This is called alpha-gamma coactivation. Gamma motor neurons contract the ends of the intrafusal fibers inside the muscle spindle, keeping the spindle tight and sensitive even while the muscle is shortening. As a result, the spindle continues sending continuous sensory feedback to the spinal cord. This allows the nervous system to make tiny adjustments in muscle force, helping you hold the cup steadily without spilling it. So remember this simple rule: alpha motor neurons produce movement, while gamma motor neurons keep the muscle spindle active, allowing smooth, accurate, and coordinated movement. Now let's put everything we've learned together. Inside the spinal cord, there are three main types of neurons, and every movement depends on these three working as a team. First are the sensory neurons, also called afferent neurons. Their job is to bring information into the spinal cord. For example, when you touch a hot cup, receptors in your skin detect the heat. The signal travels through a sensory neuron and enters the spinal cord through the dorsal or posterior root. Second are the interneurons. These are the most important neurons in the spinal cord because they perform all the processing. Think of them as traffic police at a busy road junction. Just as a traffic police officer decides which vehicles should stop and which should move, interneurons decide which signals should pass, which muscles should contract, and which should relax. They receive information from both the sensory neurons and the brain, process it within milliseconds, and make the final decision. Finally, we have the motor neurons, also called efferent neurons. These neurons carry the final command out of the spinal cord through the ventral or anterior route to the muscles, producing movement. So remember this simple sequence. Sensory neurons bring information in, interneurons integrate and decide, and motor neurons carry the final command to the muscles. No sensory input, no information. No interneurons, no decision, no motor neurons, no movement. This is the basic organization of every spinal reflex and every voluntary movement. Before we study spinal reflexes, we first need to understand the two types of motor neurons found in the spinal cord. The first is the alpha motor neuron. Think of alpha as action. Alpha motor neurons are large and fast, and they supply the extrafusal muscle fibers, the main muscle fibers that generate force. Whenever you walk, lift a book, or pick up a cup, alpha motor neurons are responsible for producing the muscle contraction. Now let's look at the gamma motor neuron. Think of gamma as guard. Gamma motor neurons are smaller and do not produce the main muscle contraction. Instead, they supply the intrafusal fibers inside the muscle spindle. Their job is to keep the muscle spindle sensitive so it can continuously detect changes in muscle length during movement. So here's an easy way to remember it. Alpha equals action leads to contracts the main muscle. Gamma equals guard leads to keeps the muscle spindle working. Both neurons work together through alpha-gamma coactivation. Alpha produces the movement while gamma maintains accurate sensory feedback, allowing movements to be smooth, precise, and well coordinated. This simple difference is one of the most important concepts in spinal cord physiology and is frequently tested in exams. Now let's talk about the most important neurons in the spinal cord, the interneurons. In fact, Guyton says that nearly 99% of all neurons in the spinal cord are interneurons. Why are they so important? Because they are the processing center of the spinal cord. Think of them as the brain inside the spinal cord. Whenever a sensory signal enters the spinal cord, it usually does not go directly to the motor neuron. Instead, it enters a network of interneurons. These interneurons receive information from sensory neurons, combine it with signals coming down from the brain, and then decide the most appropriate response. They determine which muscles should contract, which should relax, and how strong the movement should be. One special interneuron you should remember is the Renshaw cell. When an alpha motor neuron fires, it sends a small side branch to the Renshaw cell. The Renshaw cell then sends an inhibitory signal back to the same motor neuron and to nearby motor neurons. This is called recurrent inhibition. Its job is to prevent excessive muscle activity, improve precision, and make movement smooth and controlled. Interneurons also connect different spinal cord segments, allowing several muscles and even both limbs to work together during activities like standing, walking, and maintaining posture. Key takeaway: sensory neurons bring information in, motor neurons carry commands out. But interneurons are the intelligent processing center that integrates, coordinates, and fine-tunes every spinal reflex and voluntary movement. Congratulations! We've now built the foundation of spinal cord motor physiology. Let's quickly summarize what we've learned today. First, we learned that the spinal cord is not just a pathway between the brain and the body. It is an intelligent processing center that receives information, processes it, and produces the appropriate motor response. We then followed the flow of information. A sensory receptor detects a stimulus and the signal enters the spinal cord through the posterior or dorsal root. Inside the gray matter, interneurons analyze the information, combine it with signals from the brain, and decide the best response. The final command then leaves through alpha motor neurons via the anterior or ventral root, causing the muscle to contract. We also learned that gamma motor neurons do not produce movement. Instead, they keep the muscle spindle active and sensitive during muscle contraction through alpha-gamma coactivation, ensuring smooth and accurate movement. Finally, we discussed the Renshaw cell, which provides recurrent inhibition, preventing excessive muscle activity and making movements more precise. Key message to remember: the spinal cord follows one simple sequence: receive to process to respond. Sensory neurons bring information in, interneurons make the decision, and motor neurons carry out the action. In the next lecture, we'll begin our first spinal reflex, the muscle spindle and the stretch reflex, one of the most important and clinically relevant reflexes in physiology. Thank you for watching. If you found this lesson helpful, please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next lecture.